Bhunaktu, Sahano Bhunaktu, Sahavidyan Karavavahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Welcome to the webcast of our usual Saturday morning class on Bhagavad Gita. We're still at the beginning of chapter 1, Arjuna Vishada Yoga, the chapter that deals with Arjuna's Vishada, his distress. And we'll begin each class, as we have been, with some recitation, chanting. We'll start today with verse 8. Well, verse 7 is better. That's a good place to start. So we'll start with verse 7, and you can repeat each quarter after me. And as I've mentioned before, please glance at the translation while you're listening to me so that you understand what you're chanting a moment later. Asmakam tu vishishtaye, asmakam tu vishishtaye, tani bodha dvajottama, tani bodha dvajottama, nayaka mama sainyasya, mamaka mama sainyasya, sanyartam tan bravimite, sanyartam tan bravimite, Bhavan Bhishmascha Karnascha, Bhavan Bhishmascha Karnascha, Kripascha Samitinjayaha, Kripascha Samitinjayaha, Ashwathama Vikarnascha, Ashwathama Vikarnascha, Saumadattistataivacha, Saumadattistataivacha, Anye cha bahava shura, anye cha bahava shura, mararte tyakta jivitaha, mararte tyakta jivitata, nana shastra praharanaha, nana shastra praharanaha, sarve yuddha visharadaha, Sarve yuddha visharadaha, aparyaptam tadasmakam, aparyaptam tadasmakam, balam bhishma birakshitam, balam bhishma birakshitam, paryaptam tvidametesham, paryaptam tvidametesham, Balam bhima birakshitam, balam bhima birakshitam, ayaneshu cha sarveshu, ayaneshu cha sarveshu, yatha bhagam avastitaha, yatha bhagam avastitaha, Bhishma meva bhirakshantu, Bhishma meva bhirakshantu, bhavantah sarvahevahi, bhavantah sarvahevahi, tasya sanjanayan harsham, tasya sanjanayan harsham, kuru vriddha pitamaha, Kuru vriddha pitamaha, simhanaram vinadyochaihi, simhanaram vinadyochaihi, shankam dadmau pratapavan, shankam dadmau pratapavan, tatha shankascha bhiryascha, tatha shankascha bhiryascha, Panavanaka go mukhaha, Panavanaka go mukhaha, Sahasaivabhyahanyanta, Sahasavabhyahanyanta, Sashabdastu mulo bhavata, Sashabdastu mulo bhavata, Tata shvetar harar yukte, Tata shvetar harar yukte, Mahati syandane stitau, Mahati syandane stitau, Madhava Pandavaschaiva, Madhava Pandavaschaiva, Divyau Shankau Pradadmatuhu, Divyau Shankau Pradadmatuhu, Panchajanyam Hrishikesho, Panchajanyam Hrishikesho, Devadattam Dhananjayah, Devadattam Dhananjayah, Poundram Dadmau Mahashankam, Poundram Dadmau Mahashankam, Bhima Karma Vrikodaraha, Bhima Karma Vrikodayah, Ananta Vijayam Raja, Ananta Vijayam Raja, Kunti Putro Yudhishthiraha, Kunti Putro Yudhishthiraha, Nakula Sahadevascha, Nakula Sahadevascha, Sughoshamani Pushpakau, Sughoshamani Pushpakau. We'll end our recitation here and pick up the thread where we left off last week. You might remember the context is where we started chanting. Duryodhana has approached his teacher, Dronacharya, and is showing Dronacharya all of his mighty warriors who in Duryodhana's own words, they're all ready to give up their lives for his sake. So Duryodhana here is, you could look at it as bragging, but according to Madhusudana's, his observation in the commentary of Madhusudana is Duryodhana is a little worried, a little anxious now that he's on the battlefield and looking at those with whom he has to fight. And it appears that Duryodhana is trying to, the American expression is psych himself up, to encourage himself and strengthen himself emotionally for the battle that lies ahead. And that becomes really obvious in the next verse. So let's pick up the thread where we left off. Aparyaptam tadasmakam, aparyaptam tadasmakam, balam bhima birakshitam, balam bhishma birakshitam, paryaptam tvudamete sham, paryaptam tvudamete sham, balam bhima birakshitam, balam bhima birakshitam. This is an interesting verse to look at how it gets mistranslated primarily by Hindi-speaking people, because it uses this word paryaptam. Paryaptam is a paryapta, in Hindi may paryapt. When you say in Hindi, ye paryapte, or maybe more commonly, ye kafi he. You're saying this is enough, this is sufficient. But that happens to be a Hindi meaning of paryapt. And in Sanskrit, paryapta has many meanings. In fact, I looked it up in the dictionary. It gives 11 meanings for paryapta. The basic meaning from ap, to obtain, the basic meaning for paryapta is that which is obtained. But when you add that prefix, pari plus ap becomes paryap, and then a past passive participle, paryapta, for our Sanskrit students. So paryapta can simply mean what is obtained. One of the many meanings is sufficient, but if you try to read this verse with that meaning, you get the wrong meaning, the opposite meaning. So paryapta can indeed mean, it literally means that which is obtained. It can mean sufficient. It can also mean limited, that which is bounded, that which is constrained. And that's the meaning that's used here. Look at what he says. Duryodhana speaks to Drona, and he says, Tad balam, the strength, asmakam, of ours, of the strength of our army which is Bhishma abhirakshitam, which is protected by Bhishma, the strength of our army is aparyaptam. Now you have to take it in a sense of unlimited. If you take the Hindi meaning, sufficient, the strength of our army is insufficient with the incorrect translation. Wait a minute. Duryodhana is showing off to Drona. He is not going to say the strength of our army is insufficient. So it's a dead giveaway whenever you see that this verse mistranslated, where Duryodhana says the strength of our army is insufficient. It's clear it's done by someone who speaks Hindi and doesn't understand Sanskrit properly. By the way, all the commentators on the Bhagavad Gita, including Madhusudana, they all make the same observation. The observation they make is that Duryodhana's army has 11 divisions. The word they use for division is aukshahini. Aukshahini is an obscure word. It means a division of an army. And according to several commentators, I think I counted 6 different commentators altogether, they all point out that Duryodhana's army has 11 akshauhinis, 11 divisions, whereas the Pandava army only has 7 divisions. So physically, the army of Duryodhana is larger than that of the Pandavas. So most certainly, Duryodhana would say the Tad balam, the strength, asmakam, of our army, Bhishma abhirakshitam, which is protected by Bhishma, that strength is aparyaptam. It is unlimited. So please use the correct translation here. On the other hand, in the second half, you see that twidam, to idam, to, but idam balam, this strength, ete sham, of theirs, of the Pandava army, which is Bhima abhirakshitam, which is protected by Bhima, is paryaptam. And paryaptam here has to mean limited, finite, constrained. It can't possibly mean sufficient. So be on guard. The next time you pick up a Bhagavad Gita translation, look at that translation carefully. It might be incorrect. By the way, Duryodhana hates Bhima really badly. So when he says Bhima abhirakshitam, the army of the Pandavas protected by Bhima, to Duryodhana, that's a defect. I guess Duryodhana looks at Bhima as someone who's fat and not very capable. Someone who's overweight. Bhima, of course, is huge. Okay. And then, so for quite a few verses now, we've seen Duryodhana speaking to Drona about the strength of his army. He identifies all the members of his army, also of the Pandava army. And now in the next verse, Duryodhana, instead of addressing Drona, Duryodhana addresses all the other generals, the leaders of his army, and you get that from context. Ayaneshu cha sarveshu, ayaneshu cha sarveshu, yatha bhagam avastitaha, yatha bhagam avastitaha, Bhishma meva bhirakshantu, Bhishma meva bhirakshantu, bhavantah sarva eva hi, bhavantah sarva eva hi. So addressing all the other generals, Drona is one of many leaders of his army. They're all collected at the front of the battle line, and so Drona addresses the others. He says, Bhavanta sarve, all of you other generals and leaders, eva he, indeed, all of you, Bhishmam eva, I'm going backwards, starting with the last line and working our way forward. All of you, Bhishmam eva abhirakshantu, all of you, abhirakshantu, must protect Bhishmam eva. Bhishma, all of you, be careful to protect Bhishma. Why? Because Bhishma is the head of their entire army. You know, they say in military language, if you decapitate the opposing force by killing the leadership, then you win the war. So here, Bhishma is the head of their army, the Kaurava army, so therefore Duryodhana makes a special command. Be sure that you protect Bhishma. All of you leaders, in the second line, all of you leaders who are yata bhagam avastitaha, all of you leaders who are avastitaha, assembled, arrayed, yata bhagam, in your respective divisions. All of you leaders, generals who are arrayed in your respective divisions, ayaneshu sarveshu, sarveshu on all, ayaneshu on all sides. So all of you leaders who are arrayed in your respective divisions on all sides, Bhishmam eva in particular, be sure, abhirakshantu, that you protect Bhishma. And with those words, Duryodhana's speech comes to an end, and now we return to the narration given by Sanjaya. Sanjaya speaking to speaking to the blind king Dhritarashtra. Sanjaya says, Tasya sanjanayan harsham, Tasya sanjanayan harsham, Kuru vriddha pitamaha, Kuru vriddha pitamaha, Simhanaram vinadyochaihi, Simhanaram vinadyochaihi, Shankam dadmau pratapavan, Shankam dadmau pratapavan. You remember that Sanjaya was given that power to see and hear everything that was taking place on the battlefield, and with that power he narrates all these happenings to the blind king Dhritarashtra. And now he speaks of, in a second line, Kuru vriddaha pitamaha. Pitamaha, the grandfather, referring to Bhishma. Bhishma, who is Kuru vriddha, the elder of the Kuru clan. Kuru vriddha pitamaha, the eldest of the Kurus, Bhishma, who, in the third line, vinadya, simhanaram vinadya, vinadya, sounding, uttering simhanaram, the sound of a lion. It means that Bhishma roared, literally. Bhishma roared, uchaihi, he roared loudly. And after roaring loudly, by the way, the context is, let us imagine that while Duryodhana was speaking to Drona, it's likely that, and this is according to Madhusudana's commentary, Madhusudana said that Bhishma apparently looked over at Duryodhana and probably saw a look of anxiety on Duryodhana's face. Duryodhana being worried about his army's capacity to stand up on the battlefield, to be victorious on the battlefield. So for that reason, according to Madhusudana, Bhishma wants to encourage Duryodhana, strengthen Duryodhana emotionally. So what does Bhishma do? Vinadya, Simhanadam Vinadya, he roars, Uchaihi, loudly, and that in the last line, Dadmao, he blows, who is it? Pratapavan, that mighty one. Pratapavan means the mighty one, Bhishma. Bhishma Dadmao blows upon his shankam, his conch. Why? And here even Sanjaya gives also the context. He does all this. Why? Sanjanayan, causing delight, causing encouragement. Sanjaya karsham, literally. Sanjanayam, generating, causing, harsham, delight, tasya, for him, for Duryodhana. So generating delight, encouragement in the heart of Duryodhana. Of course, you can imagine the scene on the battlefield. All the armies are gathered there facing each other, and once one conch is blown, then all the other warriors are going to blow their conches. So you can just imagine, once the trend starts, the trend of blowing the conches is started here by Bhishma. Once one conch is blown, many others are blown in response, and not only conches, but Sanjaya narrates all the noise and tumult on the battlefield. Sanjaya says, Tata shankascha bhiryascha, Tata shankascha bhiryascha, Panavanaka gomukhaha, Panavanaka gomukhaha, Sahasaivabhyahanyanta, Sahasaivabhyahanyanta, Sashabdastumulo bhavata, Sashabdastumulo bhavata. Tataha, then, thereafter, after Bhishma blew his conch, then other conches, shankaha, not only conches, but bheryaha. Bheri is a kind of drum. So shank, so conches, and kettle drums, also panava. Panava is another kind of drum, and anaka. Anaka is a kind of trumpet. And along with these drums and trumpets, gomukha. Gomukha is the trumpet made of the horn of a cow. So all of these sahasa eva, suddenly, they abhyahanyanta. They all sounded, suddenly means simultaneously. So the battlefield so far had been fairly quiet. Of course, the sound of everyone talking and the horses and elephants, but relatively quiet until Bhishma blew his conch. Then in response, all the other warriors on both sides of the battlefield, they're all now blowing their conches, beating their drums, blowing on the horns. Suddenly, simultaneously, all of these sounds took place, and saha shabdaha, in the last line, that sound, abhavat, was, tumulaha. Interesting that tumula sounds like the English tumultuous. That's exactly what it means. Tumula means tumultuous, the sound taking place on the battlefield. There were thousands and thousands of warriors gathered on both sides. They're all blowing their conches and beating their drums and blowing on the horns. So it's all a tumultuous sound. Sanjaya continues to narrate. Tata shvetar harar yukte, tata shvetar harar yukte, mahati syandane stitau, mahati syandane stitau, madhava pandavaschaiva, madhava pandavaschaiva, divyau shankau pradadmatuhu, divyau shankau pradadmatuhu. Tataha, then, look down in the third line. Then Madhava, a common name for Sri Krishna, and Pandava. Pandava could mean any son of Pandu, but here it refers specifically to Arjuna. Why does it refer to Arjuna? Because Madhava and Pandava, Krishna and Arjuna, were in the second line stitau. Both of them were standing, syandane, in a chariot. Not an ordinary chariot, mahati syandane, on a great chariot, on a glorious chariot. And what about that chariot? The chariot, backing up to the first line, the chariot which was yukte, which was joined to shvetaihi haraihi hayaihi. Haya is horse. So the chariot was yukte, yoked to hayaihi, yoked to horses. What kind of horses? Shvetaihi hayaihi, yoked to white horses. You've seen this picture many times, or many of you watched the old B.R. Chopra series on the Mahabharata. I watched it 2.5 times through. I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I learned some Hindi by watching it. By watching all those, I think 96 episodes. Anyway, if you watched it, it's a little out of date today, but still, in those days, I think in the 1980s, it was quite well done for that time and place. So, Sri Krishna and Arjuna, who were standing in a great chariot yoked to white horses, what did they do? Well, they pradadmatuhu, they also blew upon divyau shankau, their own conches, which are divya, their own divine conches. And for our Sanskrit students, notice there's a lot of dual number. And Sanskrit not only has a singular and plural, but it also has a dual. So when this verse refers to Krishna and Arjuna standing, it uses a dual number. And when it talks about them blowing upon their conches, this verse also uses that dual number. Kind of unique to the Sanskrit language, that it would not have not only a singular and plural number, but a dual number as well. Sanjay continues to narrate. Panchajanyam Hrishikesho, Panchajanyam Hrishikesho, Devadattam Dhananjayaha, Devadattam Dhananjayaha, Poundram Dadmau Mahashankam, Poundram Dadmau Mahashankam, Bhima Karma Vrikodaraha, Bhima Karma Vrikodaraha. So now we get more details. So Arjuna and Krishna are blowing on their conches, but their conches have names. This is real typical of the style of the Mahabharata. They give so much detail. If you're standing in a grove of trees, the Mahabharata will tell you what kind of trees there are. If there are flowers growing on bushes, the Mahabharata will describe in detail what kinds of flowers they are, what colors, what types of flowers they are. This is The style of this Mahakavya, this great epic poem, Mahabharata, Ramayana has a similar style. All these details are given. That's how the Mahabharata grows to be 84,000 verses in length. So here the details given are the names of the conches blown by Sri Krishna and Arjuna. So Hrishikesha is a name for Lord Krishna. Hrishikesha, Krishna blew upon a conch called Panchajanyam. So Hrishikesha Panchajanman Janma Panchajanyam, the name of the conch. Speaking of names, one thing Madhusudana likes to do in his commentary is explain the meanings of all these names. Shankaracharya, I don't think, gives so much attention in his commentary, but Madhusudana is very particular about explaining all of these names. For example, why should Sri Krishna be referred to as Hrishikesha? And here the word is a compound, and you have to be very careful to split the compound word properly. The compound word is Hrishika, followed by Isha. Isha means Lord. Hrishika means senses, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. So Hrishika Isha means the indwelling. The term Madhusudana uses the antaryami, the Lord's indwelling presence, that divine presence in each person. Here the Isha, the Lord of the senses. By the way, just a side comment, this word Hrishikesha obviously is where the town of Hrishikesh got its name. But what's interesting, when you use the Hindi form Hrishikesh, you can easily mistranslate it because Kesha means hair, and some people think that Hrishikesh is the place where all the hairy rishis used to live. They had long matted locks, and that is a ridiculous translation. Hrishikesh comes from Hrishikesha. It's a name for Lord Krishna, the Isha, the Lord of the Hrishika, of the senses, the indwelling divine presence of the Lord, of Lord Krishna. So, Hrishikesha, Lord Krishna blew on his conch named Panchajanyam, and Arjuna, here called Dhananjaya, Arjuna blew on his conch Devadattam. Dhananjaya is a name for Arjuna. Why is Arjuna called Dhananjaya? Dhananjaya literally means the conqueror of wealth. Now, offhand, that doesn't seem to make much sense. Arjuna is a warrior. In what sense is Arjuna the conqueror of wealth? Well, Madhusudana likes to explain all this. He says that before the war, Yudhishthira performed what was called a Digvijaya. Digvijaya means you send your armies out in all four directions to either form alliances with the neighboring kingdom or to conquer the neighboring kingdoms. In either event, whether you conquer them or form an alliance with them, you get money. If you form an alliance, they pay a tribute, and if you conquer them, you take over their treasury. And it was Arjuna who was at the head of these armies who went out in the four directions, Dik. So in this Digvijaya, Arjuna was crucial in forming alliances with or conquering other kingdoms, and in that way he received all these funds which were essential to, and we forget the details. If you're going to fight a war, you have to finance it. So with all that money, Yudhishthira could finance this huge army assembled for this battle. Then, so Krishna blew upon Panchajanyam, Dhananjaya, Arjuna blew upon Devadattam. Then also, Poundram Dadmau Mahashankam Bhima Karma Vrikodaraha. So now Bhima is described. Bhima is described as Dadmau blowing upon Mahashankam, a great conch called Poundram. And here Bhima is named as Bhima Karma, not just Bhima, but Bhima Karma. The karma, the deeds of Bhima were Bhima. Bhima as an adjective means fearful. So Bhima here is called Bhima Karma, one whose deeds strike fear into the hearts of the opponents. Bhima is also called Vrikodara. I made a reference to him before as being fat. He was big, he was mighty, but he wasn't fat, because it says here that his udara, his stomach, was like that of a vrika, a wolf. So he had, I guess, the wolf, like a dog. Dogs generally don't have a belly that hangs down, but a belly that goes up. So Bhima here is called Vrikodara, one who has a belly like a wolf, one who is as fierce as a wolf. Sanjaya continues his narration. Ananta Vijayam Raja, Ananta Vijayam Raja, Kunti Putro Yudhishthiraha, Kunti Putro Yudhishthiraha, Nakula Sahadevascha, Nakula Sahadevascha, Sughoshamani Pushpakau, Sughoshamani Pushpakau. So we've learned the names of the conches belonging to Krishna, to Arjuna, and to Bhima. Now, Raja Yudhishthira, Raja king, Raja Yudhishthira, King Yudhishthira, prince, but the future king, who is Kunti Putraha, the son of Kunti. So King Yudhishthira, the son of Kunti, he blew upon his conch, which was called Ananta Vijayam, the one whose victory is endless. So the name of his conch, Ananta Vijayam. Then Nakula and Sahadeva, we're getting all of the 5 Pandavas are being named here. So Nakula and Sahadeva, the twins, the youngest of the Pandava brothers, they also blew upon their conches. What were the names of their conches? Sughosha was the conch of Nakula, and Mani Pushpaka is the name of the conch of Sahadeva. Sughosha, it sounds nice, has a nice sounding conch. And Mani Pushpaka, the one which is like a jewel-like flower. They're very elaborate names. Sanjaya continues this narration of all the, Sanjaya continues this narration of all the conches. Kashyascha parameshwasaha, Kashyascha parameshwasaha, Shikhandi cha maharataha, Shikhandi cha maharataha, Drishtadyumno viratascha, Drishtadyumno viratascha, Satyakischa parajataha, Satyakischa parajataha. All of these are the warriors blowing their conches. And who are the warriors blowing their conches? Kashyaha. The king of Kashi is Kashya, and the king of Kashi is called Parameshwasaha. Here you really have to break apart the words. Parameshwasaha. Parama, issue, asa. The one who is an asa, a thrower of issue, arrows, but who is Parama, the greatest. the greatest thrower of arrows. Of course, we'd never translate it like that. The greatest of archers. So the greatest of archers, the king of Kashi, is one of those blowing a conch. Also Shikandi, who is Maharataha. One of the generals of the Pandava army is Shikandi. There's such an elaborate story about Shikandi. I won't share it here. Also, Drishtadyumna. Drishtadyumna is the leader of the Pandava army. And Virata, another one of their generals, the king of Virata. And Satyaki. Satyaki earlier was referred to as Duryodhana, but that's not a common name. Satyaki is his name, another great general, a great warrior who is called Aparajataha, unconquered by anyone else. So Sanjaya continues to narrate all of these great warriors on the Pandava side who are blowing their conches, and that concludes here. Drupado Draupadeyascha, Drupado Draupadeyascha, Sarvasha Prativipate, Sarvasha Prativipate, Saubhadrashcha Mahabahuhu, Saubhadrashcha Mahabahuhu, Shankan Dadmu Pratak Prataka, Shankan Dadmu Pratak Prataka. So, along with all the other warriors, Sanjaya continues to narrate Drupada and Draupadeyaha. Not only Drupada, but the sons of his daughter Draupadi. All of them, and dropping down to the third line, Saubhadraha, the son of Subhadra, Abhimanyu, who is Mahabahuhu. He has mighty arms. He's a mighty son of Subhadra. All of them, in the final line, Dadmuhu, they all blew Shankan, their conches. They all blew their conches, pratak, individually. All of these great warriors blew their conches. And the second line, Sarvashaha, Sarvashaha, all over. They were gathered they were spread about the battlefield, and they all blew their conches, Prativipate. And here, Sanjaya addresses King Dhritarashtra. Prativipati is king of the land, master of the land. It's a name for king. O King Dhritarashtra, all of these great warriors were blowing individually upon their conches. Sarvashaha, all over the battlefield, but all over not both sides of the battlefield. It's significant here that Sanjaya has been narrating the Pandava warriors, not the Kauravas. So remember that all of these conches and drums and horns and all of it, it began with Bhishma on the Kaurava side. But then Sanjaya went on to narrate everyone on the Pandava side that was blowing their conches. Why? Because apparently, and we'll get this in the very next verse, the Pandavas appeared to make more noise. They blew their horns more noisily. Even though they were fewer in number, the noise generated by the Pandava armies was more than that of the Kaurava armies, and we learn that from the very next verse. Saghosho dhartarashtranam, Saghosho dhartarashtranam, hridayani vyadarayata, hridayani vyadarayata, nabascha prativim chaiva, nabascha prativim chaiva, tumulo bhyanunarayan, tumulo bhyanunarayan. Excuse me. Sanjaya continues to narrate. He says, Saha Goshaha, that sound. Remember, he's been narrating the sound created by the Pandavas blowing upon their conches and their drums and their horns. So Saha Goshaha, that sound, that uproar, Dhartarashtranam, for the sons of Dhritarashtra, for the Kaurava army, Hrirayani Vyadarayata, Saghoshaha, that sound, Vyadarayataha, pierced the Hrirayani, pierced the hearts, Dhartarashtranam, of all those in the Kaurava army, of the sons of Dhritarashtra in general, and of Duryodhana in particular. Look at this. So the warriors on both sides of the battlefield were blowing their conches, but because the Pandavas apparently blew their conches so loudly, it pierced the hearts of the Kauravas, and I guess the expression would be the great sound struck fear into the hearts of the sons of Dhritarashtra, struck fear into the hearts of the Kaurava army. And just to show that Sanjaya here is emphasizing the might and strength of the Pandava army. And he is narrating this to the blind king Dhritarashtra, who at this point is probably getting pretty uncomfortable, quite concerned. Not only did it strike fear into the hearts of the Kauravas, but also in the last line, Tumalaha abhyanunarayan. Tumalaha. Then there's our nice word again, tumult. The tumult or tumultuous noise. That tumultuous noise, abhyanunarayan, literally echoed. Nada is a sound. Anunara is an echo. To sound after is an echo. So that sound, anunarayan, it echoed, it resounded. Nabascha, in the sky, prativimcha eva, and on the earth. So in all directions, in the sky and the earth, that sound echoed. So here Sanjaya is presenting this sense of this overpowering sound, created in particular by the Pandava army. Then, I think that's enough of the conches. Quite elaborate. This is the style of the Mahabharata. This first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, as I said in the introduction, the first chapter really is a continuation of the story that we find in the Mahabharata. And that story continues through the entire first chapter and the beginning part of the second chapter. So this is nice, gives you an idea of the style and richness of the storytelling that takes place in the Mahabharata. Then we continue. Atah vyavastitan drishtva, atah vyavastitan drishtva, dhartarashtran kapidvajaha, dhartarashtran kapidvajaha pravritte shastra sampate pravritte shastra sampate dhanurudyam ya pandavaha dhanurudyam ya pandavaha. Atha, then. And to get the subject of the sentence, you have to go way down into the last line. Pandavaha. Again, Pandava can refer to any of the sons of Pandu, but here it refers specifically to Arjuna. Ata, then, Pandavaha, Arjuna, back up to the first line, Drishtva, having seen, Dhartarashtran, the sons of Dhritarashtra, the army of the Kauravas, having seen them, who was Vyavastitan, having seen the army Vyavastitan assembled there on the battlefield. Arjuna is facing the opposing army of the Kauravas. Then Arjuna here, who is called Kapidvaja. Another story. Arjuna whose chariot bears the dvaja, the flag or emblem of Kapi. Kapi, of course, is a monkey, not just any monkey, but Hanuman. There's a long story, I won't narrate it here, about how Hanuman wanted to accompany Arjuna on the battlefield, so he took the form of this flag or emblem. Interesting story, but we'll leave it aside here. So Arjuna, whose chariot bears the emblem or flag of Hanuman, then what did Arjuna do? Dhanur, in the last line, Dhanur udyamya, picking up his dhanush, his bow. Arjuna lifted his bow, pravritte shastra sampate. Shastra is weapon. Sampate. As weapons were being prepared. Pravritte, being prepared. Pravritte, as something was taking place. As what was taking place? Shastra sampate, as all the weapons were being prepared. So Arjuna picks up his bow, and all the other warriors are also preparing their weapons, their bows, their spears, their clubs. So as all the weapons from all the warriors were being prepared, the sentence continues. So the sentence isn't complete here. This first verse, by the way, I should mention that verses are not sentences. A sentence can begin in one verse and conclude in the next verse. A single verse can contain several sentences. So there's no connection between sentence and verse. So here, this verse is the beginning of a sentence. The sentence concludes in the next verse. So here, Arjuna, having looked across the battlefield, seeing all the warriors assembled there on the other side, the Kaurava warriors, seeing them prepare their weapons, lift their bows, lift their spears, lift their clubs, Arjuna also lifted his bow, and then the sentence concludes, Hrishikesham tada vakyam, Hrishikesham tada vakyam, idamaha mahipate, idamaha mahipate. Tada, and then, idam vakyam, idam, this, vakyam, this statement. Aha, he said. Who said? Arjuna said. Who did he say it to? Hrishikesham. As you saw before, he said to Sri Krishna, Mahipate, Again, Sanjaya addressing King Dhritarashtra. O King, Mahipate Tada, then Arjuna said the following words to Lord Krishna. And before we see what Arjuna said, it would be, I think, important to know how Sri Krishna ended up as Arjuna's charioteer. Now, Sri Krishna had a very unique role with the Pandavas in general, and Arjuna in particular. For the Pandavas in general, he was a highly respected advisor who was somewhat understood as an avatara. This is very little complicated here. Earlier in the Mahabharata, Sri Krishna revealed his cosmic form in the palace before the war took place. I should mention, some of you know of the famous Vishvarupa Darshana, Sri Krishna's revelation of his cosmic form, which takes place in the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. But that's not the only time in the Mahabharata where Sri Krishna revealed his cosmic form. He did so several times, and one of those times was before the war took place, where Sri Krishna revealed his cosmic form to everyone in the palace. I guess Sri Krishna was at that point in time trying to shake up Duryodhana for the sake of dissuading him from fighting this terrible war. Obviously, it didn't work. Sri Krishna revealed his cosmic form, and apparently Duryodhana thought that it was some kind of magic trick. Duryodhana didn't take it seriously, but of course it was serious. I believe the Pandavas were also present there, so they saw Sri Krishna display his cosmic form. They knew that Sri Krishna wasn't an ordinary person. Interesting. But then there's another event, and we have to recall several of these events to really understand the setting of the Bhagavad Gita. So the setting of the Bhagavad Gita is that Sri Krishna and Arjuna are together there in the chariot. How is it that Sri Krishna ends up as Arjuna's charioteer? Generally, warriors have specially trained charioteers. Sri Krishna was not a charioteer at all. Sri Krishna was the head of his own army. Sri Krishna had an entire army. Sri Krishna was the head of a kingdom. How does this great king, Sri Krishna was a king of a kingdom. How does this great king end up as Arjuna's charioteer? There's a wonderful story, and it's important to know this story to understand the context of the Bhagavad Gita. So let's remember. Some of you know the story well. If you don't remember the story, or if you haven't heard it, it's worth hearing. Before the battle took place, both Arjuna and Duryodhana were engaged in forming alliances with other kingdoms, with other kings, trying to build up their armies and build up the strength of their sides, respectively. So both Arjuna and Duryodhana knew that Sri Krishna had a mighty army, had a tremendous army. So the story goes, interesting story, both Arjuna and Duryodhana both went to meet Krishna, and they both arrived at the same time. Very unique timing, interesting timing. They arrived at Sri Krishna's palace at the exact same time, and at that time, Sri Krishna happened to be sleeping. So he was in his room, sound asleep. Arjuna and Duryodhana arrive. They probably exchanged glances when they talk about, what do they say, daggers coming out of their eyes. So I suppose daggers were coming out of Arjuna's eyes towards Duryodhana and out of Duryodhana's eyes towards Arjuna. And they both went to Sri Krishna's room to speak to him. They both saw that Sri Krishna was sound asleep, and they were both respectful enough not to wake Sri Krishna. So they waited. Duryodhana took a chair right at Lord Krishna's head, at the head of the bed. Arjuna apparently stood very respectfully at the foot of Sri Krishna's bed. So you can see the attitudes of these two being displayed. Arjuna with his hands folded, waiting patiently at the feet of Sri Krishna, at the foot of his bed, and Duryodhana kind of arrogantly waiting at the head of Sri Krishna's bed. The story is very clever. Finally, Sri Krishna wakes up and he sits up in bed. When Sri Krishna sits up, he's now facing Arjuna with his back to Duryodhana. Very interesting moment. So Sri Krishna wakes up and sees Arjuna and says, "Oh, Arjuna, you've come." And Arjuna says, "Yes, I came to seek your help in a battle." And of course now Duryodhana must get upset. And he says, "Wait a minute, I'm also here. Don't ignore me," he says to Krishna. Krishna turns around and says, "Oh, you're here also." I don't know how it came off, but I can imagine. In my imagination, Krishna says, "Oh, you too?" Anyway, so they're both there. And they both explain, both Arjuna and Krishna explain how they've come to seek Sri Krishna's support in the battle that's about to take place. And they both ask for Sri Krishna's support. Now, Sri Krishna is in a tricky position. He is related to both sides of the family. And so he's duty bound to help them both. So Sri Krishna says, "Okay, I will help both of you. And the way I'll help you," Sri Krishna says, "is one of you can have my vast army with all the warriors, with all the horses, with all the elephants, and with all the weaponry. One of you can have my entire army. The other one of you can have me, and me alone, with the condition that I won't fight. I won't lift a weapon. So you can choose. One of you can have me and me alone, with the condition that I won't fight, and the other can have my great army." And then Duryodhana says, "Okay, then Duryodhana would obviously want to choose his army." Duryodhana doesn't care about Krishna, thinks he's a magician, not anyone special. So Duryodhana says, "Okay, then I choose." And Sri Krishna stops him and says, "Wait a minute, who said you can choose first? Duryodhana is younger than you. Arjuna is your baby cousin." And the tradition, of course, is the younger ones always get to choose first. So Duryodhana is quite upset, but he has no choice but to acquiesce, and he allows Arjuna to choose first. Who does Arjuna choose? Arjuna chooses Krishna. For several reasons. Arjuna has this gut feeling that Sri Krishna is someone very special. Arjuna has not yet seen the Vishwarupa that's going to be displayed, the cosmic form that's going to be displayed later in chapter 11. But But Arjuna knows that Sri Krishna is someone divine, someone special. They're also close friends. So for all of these reasons, Arjuna chooses Sri Krishna to be on his side. Duryodhana then is delighted to receive the vast army of Sri Krishna, not disappointed at all. And what happens then is Sri Krishna has agreed to help Arjuna, but Sri Krishna said, but I won't fight. So the arrangement develops then, and that is the charioteer doesn't do the fighting. So Sri Krishna, by becoming Arjuna's charioteer, can constantly be on the battlefield with Arjuna, guiding him, leading him at all times, but without fighting. So in this way, Sri Krishna becomes Arjuna's charioteer later when the battle is fought. And this is a good place to conclude our class. We'll continue next time. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhaveta Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.